So welcome everybody to our second webinar of today. Those of you who went to the very first webinar, it was A Child in the Holy Land by Qiblih Muhajir. We were very fortunate to have Joel Nizin, Kathy Hogenson, and Gary Hogenson here to talk about their book, Servant to the Servants. If you were in the very first webinar, it's a blessing to work as an editor at the Publishing Trust, but it's even more of a blessing when you get to learn, you're editing a book and you get to learn new things that you haven't learned before. And that was the case with Qiblih Muhajir's book, A Child in the Holy Land, and it's definitely the case just as much with Servant to the Servants. And I'm very happy to have Joel, Gary, and Kathy here with me today. And just to note that if you were not able to attend the first webinar, the problem at the end of the week, these webinars will be online on the YouTube channel of the Wilmette Institute. So if you missed it, or if you're talking to one of your friends about it and they said, oh, I really wish I could have gone to that, but I didn't, it's no worries. It's going to be on the YouTube channel of the Wilmette Institute. And it will also be in podcast form on various platforms at the end of the week. Let me tell you a little bit about the authors here. Joel Nizin is a Northern New Jersey double-boarded colorectal surgeon who has been in practice for nearly 40 years. He is blessed with his wife, 2 daughters, and 6 grandchildren. Research on Baha'i history, family genealogy, photography, travel, and hiking are among his diverse interests. He's created several multi-year programs for youth, including Badash Prep, and Turning 15. This is his first book. Gary Hogenson is originally from Michigan, currently lives in Florida, and has a degree in international. He enjoyed a global career in engineering and finance, which included a decade in Latin America and 18 years in the finance department at the Baha'i World Center. He's married to Kathryn Hogenson, and they have 2 daughters and 3 grandsons. Kathryn Jewett Hogenson, a native of Virginia and a resident of Florida, is a lawyer by profession and historian by choice, as well as a wife, mother, and grandmother. A frequent lecturer, she has authored Lighting the Western Sky, The Hearst Pilgrimage, and the Establishment of the Baha'i Faith in the West, and Infinite Horizons, The Life and Times of Horace Holly, as well as other published works. And just before we get started, I'm going to place in the chat a link to the book Servant to the Servants, so that you can go to it and order it, and you'll find it very, very enlightening. So please, everyone, give a warm welcome to Joel Nizin, Kathy Hogenson, and Gary Hogenson. It's all yours, guys.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for letting me go first. And I just want to wish Kathy a happy upcoming birthday. Roy Wilhelm has been an interest of mine for more than 20 years. And it's curious to learn about the hands of the cause of God. There have been so many of them, 50 to be exact. As you might know, that Bahá'u'lláh appointed 4 of them. Here are their pictures and names. Abdu'l-Baha mentioned 4 hands of the cause also. And then Shoghi Effendi appointed 42, which makes a total of 50. This group on the slide are the ones who were appointed after their passage, Roy Wilhelm being one of those. But then there were 3 contingents of hands that were appointed. Here's the first contingent. You can see all these incredible individuals. The second contingent, I hope some of you might have had the opportunity to meet some of them. Here's the third contingent. And then some additional hands were appointed at other various times. None of the hands at this time are living. Only the central figures of the faith could appoint the hands of the cause, which means that now that Baha'u'lláh, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi are passed away, no more hands of the cause can be made. one of the first questions is, why is it important to study these individuals whose lives are so rich? And I'm going to start by talking about one of them a little bit, which is Martha Root, who's considered the foremost hand of the cause of God. The interesting part is that Roy Wilhelm, the topic of our conversation today, is the one who first told her about the Baha'i faith. In March of 1908, he had returned from pilgrimage in 1907 with his mother. He was on a business trip in Pittsburgh, and the hotel where he was staying, the kitchen was closed, so he had to go next door to Child's Restaurant. The place was packed. He had to sit in the back, and there was a table of a large number of women who were having a discussion about religion. Martha Root was there at the table, and she was fairly quiet during that conversation. As the ladies arose to leave, Roy, in a most improper 1908 fashion, introduced himself to the ladies and made a few comments. Martha Root, as she was passing out, silently handed him one of her business cards. And he contacted her, giving her literature, which he then passed to somebody else. However, soon after, in January of 1909, Roy Wilhelm was in Pittsburgh again, and he met this time with Martha Root separately at a different restaurant, and they spoke for a number of hours. Martha Root returned to New York City and interacted with many other Baha'is and became a Baha'i at that time. So here's the foremost hand of the cause. Her original teacher was Roy Wilhelm. This is what Abdu'l-Baha says about the hands of the cause, who are the chief stewards of Baha'u'llah's embryonic world commonwealth. And in his Willed Testament, he says, they are to diffuse the divine fragrances, to edify the souls of men, to promote learning, to improve the character of all men, and to be at all times and under all conditions sanctified and detached from earthly things. They must manifest the fear of God by their conduct, their manners, their deeds, and their words. What's fascinating to me is that Roy Wilhelm, among many others, were appointed after his death. So he evinced all of these attributes without the title because of his sterling character. Roy was born in Zanesville, Ohio in 1875, within a year or two of the birth of Martha Root, who was also born in Ohio. And here's a picture of his house with his mother and father, Otis and Laurie Wilhelm. Laurie being a descendant of the Mayflower group who came at that time. And here's a picture, little bit hard to see, of Otis, Laurie, and Roy. This is in the 1890s. This is, Roy is still a young man. Here, again, a picture of Roy Wilhelm as a youth. I think he's around 20 or 21 in this picture. The next part of what I'm going to talk about is the souvenir picnic. The reason I became interested in Roy Wilhelm was because of this picnic, which is held every year in Teaneck, New Jersey, and it's been held annually since 1912. And it missed once or twice because of war and COVID, but it has been a yearly event since 1912. The property where the picnic is held is Roy Wilhelm's property, which he deeded to the National Spiritual Assembly in the 1940s. And here's the actual invitation card that was sent out by Mrs. Kinney to invite people, and you can see no children were intended to be present, although some did come. Abdu'l-Baha, who came to the United States in 1912, was traveling extensively, talking in many, many places. And he was not a young man at that time. And at one point, he needed a slight amount of rest, and the suggestion was to have a picnic. Since 1908, there had been picnics at Roy Wilhelm's property. This is what Abdu'l-Baha said about that first picnic, that the hearts will be bound together, spirits blended, and a new foundation of unity established. All the friends will come. They will be my guests. They will be as the parts and members of one body. The spirit of life manifest in that body will be one spirit. The foundation of that temple of unity will be one foundation. Each will be a stone in that foundation, solid and interdependent. Each will be as a leaf, blossom, or fruit upon one tree. For the sake of fellowship and unity, I desire this feast and spiritual gathering. And you can see how in everything that Abdu'l-Baha did and said, he was promoting unity. The picnic was actually held on property next to Roy Wilhelm's property, so they were actually squatting on land which he did not own. He eventually did own it, but at the time of the picnic, he did not. And here are some pictures of the picnic, and you can see there are some children present. The women in all their bedizened finery. Here's Abdu'l-Baha with some of the guests. Again, a few more pictures. People climbing trees. Abdu'l-Baha talking to the crowd. In 1908, Roy, Laurie, and Otis moved into Teaneck. They'd lived in Ohio. Roy had actually moved to New York City about 1901 after living in Costa Rica for several years. You'll hear more about that in a few moments. And the family decided that they missed the woods, the serenity of their native home in Ohio, so they found a spot in Teaneck and they moved to it. Louis Bourgeois, who was the architect of the Mother Temple in Wilmette, was their next door neighbor. He lived one street away. He had moved there a few months earlier. And with his help, Louis Bourgeois designed and built a house for the Wilhelms. Here, you see Abdu'l-Baha, Roy Wilhelm, and others sitting on the steps of the Wilhelm house. Along with some of the translators, you can see Varka in the front. Here's what the house looks like today, and these are the same steps that you just saw where everybody was sitting. So the house is now a place for people to visit. There's a prayer room. The caretakers of the property live on the second floor, and it's been preserved, the spot where Abdu'l-Baha stayed overnight 2 different times in this building. So it has been preserved and it's a place for prayer. And here again, a picture of Abdu'l-Baha at the Unity Feast with one of his translators directly behind him. My co-authors, Gary and Kathy, made a pilgrimage up to Teaneck to visit me, to see the grave sites of Otis and Laurie Wilhelm, and to visit the property. And here is a marker showing the spot where Abdu'l-Baha actually anointed the 300 plus guests at that picnic with rose of attar. So this is a marker which was placed in 1932. People who were at the original picnic testified that this was the original spot. And Curtis Kelsey actually made a copper box. It was placed under this marker, which I was allowed to unearth and send to the archives, which showed this was the exact spot where Abdu'l-Baha stood for that time. Now the picnic, which has continued for all these years, has a large amount of diversity. And I'm showing this particular picture in 1927, and I could show any other souvenir picture at this time. And you can see the wide diversity of people. In the front row, sitting to the left, is Ali Quli Khan with his daughter. You can see a sign of the greatest name. and the first African-American female believer in the United States, Olive Jackson, who lived in New York City. She was an actress, is actually in black sitting behind the sign. And next to her, you can see Louis Gregory. Schafflacher is all the way to the right. There are many people in this picture, but the point is to show the diversity that came to the picnic. This is unique in history because in 1912, the 1920s, the amount of racism in this country was overwhelming. There were lynchings, there were race riots, there were individuals who were displaced from their homes because of fires. You know about the one in East St. Louis, which was publicized in the news in the last few years. So this was very unusual to have rich and poor, young and old, black and white, all sorts of people from different classes of society mingling together, sitting together, shoulder by shoulder, and having food together in a unity picnic. This is a most unique event. And you might wonder, how is it that Roy Wilhelm, born in a white little town, Zanesville in Ohio, was able to morph into this individual who promoted race unity? Just so you know, he interacted with George Washington Carver. When his father passed away, he deliberately had a black minister come to say the eulogy at his father's funeral. And you can see the diversity in this picture. So we'll talk about this, Kathy and Gary will talk about further about Roy Wilhelm's transformation by his tutoring accompaniment by the central figures of the Baha'i faith, Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, to become this incredible person, a hand to the cause of God. Here's another picnic, 1948. You can see they're all gathered around a log cabin, which was built between 1916 and 1926 by Roy and his father and a few others, which is still there. The National Spiritual Assembly often traveled to different places in their early existence because a lot of the believers were not aware of the importance of the National Spiritual Assembly. They didn't know who they were, and the members as a group traveled. And here you can see on the Wilhelm property, the National Spiritual Assembly having a consultation, sitting informally in chairs, and prominently displayed here in front is Louis Gregory, a member of the National Spiritual Assembly. Another picture of Roy, very good friend, Louis Gregory. Louis Gregory, as you might know, another very important hand of the cause, traveled extensively in the South giving talks. And at various points, he was arrested by local police and imprisoned. In one of these instances, to get out of jail, Roy Wilhelm actually wrote a letter to the judge commenting on Louis Gregory's upright character and who he was. He was a trained lawyer, which instead of complaining to the judge that Louis was imprisoned incorrectly, Roy praised the judge for all of his careful work. Subsequently, Louis Gregory was released. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to my co-host, Gary.
Can everyone hear me all right, I hope? And so what this man that we've been introduced to, Roy Wilhelm, what do you suppose some of the qualities that Shoghi Effendi saw in Roy that led to him being named a hand of the cause? Well, it starts with Roy's mom. Roy's mother was an ardent seeker. She studied the Bible for messages and what the Bible had to say about the day we lived in at that time. And her mother was the same, and her mother's mother was the same. And Roy was immersed in this household of strong Protestant Christian women who studied the Bible, and they weren't churchgoers, but they had, from their reading, had really started to understand that this was the time for the return. In fact, they even felt that this would probably happen somewhat, even in their own lifetime. You know, as Joel has said, Roy grew up in Zanesville, Ohio, and we saw his house where he grew up. And the little town's famous for its Y bridge. It kind of begs the question, why? We have a picture of Roy's dad. Dad was an educated man. He was a university graduate, but Roy, he wasn't that interested in school. He had a little trouble staying in at his desk in school. In fact, he ran away from home at least 3 times that we're aware of. And Mom and Dad found him and brought him back, except that 3rd time, he figured out how to cover his tracks. And so next thing we know, he's a young man at this point, and we find him up in Boston selling coffee going from town to town, selling coffee for the Qiblih coffee company and its Victor brand. There's a fascinating story about that in the book. But this is the beginning of Roy's interest in coffee. And then all of a sudden we find out, well, we don't have the exact dates, but we know it's the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that now he's ended up in Costa Rica. He bought a coffee farm. Now he's learning the business of coffee, starting with the coffee bush and the coffee cherries that he would have picked and processed and dried and bagged. He learned, what was needed to grow really outstanding coffee, the kind of weather conditions and soil conditions and moisture. So this was a training ground for Roy, because before long, we find Roy has opened up a green coffee brokerage business in New York City. Okay. And this New York, of course, is the center of commerce, and Roy is right there. 104 Wall Street is his address. Just a few blocks from the docks where the coffee would come in and the warehouses where it would be stored before it was shipped to his customers throughout the United States. And because of the nature of this business of communicating with customers and overseas and where he bought the coffee, he had a cable address, so he would be sending cables back and receiving them from overseas. He knew how to move money from the United States to foreign countries, and he was. This would become very important, and mail. International mail came to Roy's address, and this become important for the master and later for Shoghi Effendi. And he developed a reputation in a rough and tumble business as someone who was discreet and honest and generous. He helped set many of the industry standards in this embryonic business. So this is an important part of his development. And there you can see the green coffee in the bags getting ready to go. And down towards the bottom, you'll see men sitting around a table with cups of coffee. This is called cupping, and it was a skill that has to be learned and developed. And Roy apparently was very good at that, and being able to discriminate good quality from bad quality. So this is his business, and as you can see, he's a handsome young man in his coat and tie. He was very conservative and becomes, relatively prosperous at doing in this coffee business. And he's able to get an apartment in the Upper West Side near Columbia University. And I was going to say around 1903, he realizes that mom is still back in Ohio, and she's still on this quest to find what are the biblical prophecies and what do they mean. And Roy not so much is interested, but he's at least tolerant of her. But she comes with her husband to New York because there aren't any Baha'is in Zanesville, Ohio, or nearby, and she wants to meet these Baha'is. And so Roy takes her to meetings, and so she gets to know more about the faith. And of course, he's sitting in the same room with her, and he becomes intrigued by what he's hearing, but not necessarily convinced that this is still the answer. And actually, Abdu'l-Baha hears about Roy and writes to him. And Roy, even after mom and dad go back home, Roy continues to meet with the Baha'is in New York and then learn more and strengthen his understanding of the faith. And whenever he's traveling out, he's in the Midwest or on the West Coast or wherever, he takes the time to meet with Baha'is there. So he's getting more involved without any really serious commitment at this time. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, Dad's getting a little worried about, now his son seems to be going down this track along with his wife. And so he takes, because of their interest in this strange new religion, he decides he's going to write to Abdu'l-Baha so that he can go on pilgrimage and find out more about the strange faith. And so he writes to Abdu'l-Baha and gets a letter back, in a short time later. And this is an interesting letter. He's written about pilgrimage, and he gets a letter back from Abdu'l-Baha, and he says, well, it wouldn't be wise for you to come at this time. Well, that's a strange letter to get. Probably a little bit shocking for Otis to receive that. But he goes on, in the next sentence it says, but your son can come. Okay, Otis can't come, but his son can come. What a strange letter. So Roy continues to study the faith, and then around 1907, Mom writes to go on pilgrimage, and she's invited to go on pilgrimage, and Roy goes along with her, and so they go to Haifa, and they're staying at Abdullah Pasha, he's going around. He goes to Haifa with his mom and sees where the shrine of the Bab is being built, but Abdu'l-Baha, he can see when he looks out his window in the morning, Abdu'l-Baha's meeting with many of the friends who come, most of them seeking his help. And he was very busy, but he's also unable to accompany people, the pilgrims outside of Accra. outside of Abdul Pasha. And so on the last day, the pilgrims go to Baji, to the resting place of Bahá'u'lláh. And, one of the things that had happened to Roy when he was in New York, and I should mention this, is that when Roy was, he has very much a routine, and he's very organized and does everything the same as you see. He's very fastidious dresser, and he got up, and one time when he was getting dressed, he was tying his shoes, and all of a sudden the room went blank, and he looks, and all he can see are some white plaster walls, and there's a kind of a strange divan pushed up against the wall. And in this dream, this vision that he's having in his bedroom, a man walks towards him and approaches Roy, takes his hand, removes a ring from Roy's hand and puts it on his own. Now, this man is dressed very distinguished looking, a long, luxurious dark beard, Oriental dress. And so he's taken this ring from Roy's hand, and now the man takes a ring from his own hand and places it on Roy's hand. Well, this is a strange vision to have, especially for a guy from the Midwest who don't do visions and mystic experiences very well. They're pretty practical. So Roy's pretty quiet about, he's not telling anybody about that, just in case people think he might be might be a little bit strange, right? So he's had this vision back in New York, and now he's had this wonderful experience on pilgrimage in Haifa and Akka. He's gone to Baji to pray at Baha'u'llah's grave, and then in the afternoon they go and they have a picnic at the Rizwan Gardens. Now, this is a place Baha'u'lláh loved to come to the Rizwan Gardens. It was so tranquil, with the water trickling through there, and the mulberry trees over the bench where he sat. So it was just a wonderful place to escape, and a great place for the pilgrims to have a picnic and reflect on Baha'u'lláh. And as part of the pilgrimage, the pilgrims would always be taken to this little house that was next to the gardens, where Baha'u'lláh would go and rest. And while he was at Rizwan Gardens. And after Roy walked into this room, he saw the image of his vision, the one that he had seen in that picnic, or when he was tying his shoes that day. So now this is strange indeed. But for now, this is kind of a moment, is a transformational moment for Roy. And so they return to New York, and Abdul Baha writes to Roy that now he is a true and confirmed believer. And I think later, probably at the time that Abdul Baha was at the picnic in Teaneck, he explains to Roy about that vision, and that it was what it was Baha'u'lláh wedding himself to Roy, and Roy marrying and wedding himself to Baha'u'lláh. So anyway, Roy was always close to his parents. They lived with him almost all his life. either when he was growing up in Ohio or in New York, and his mother later in Maine. But now Roy was really became a fully engaged member of the Baha'i community, as does his mom, and his dad always remained steadfast. And Roy becomes a salesman for Bahá'u'lláh and an ardent teacher. An ardent teacher of the faith. He uses those salesman skills that he learned selling coffee. When you're selling something, you find a prospect and you qualify that prospect, you close the deal. But you have to learn to deal with rejections and keep on going and knocking on that door. And also, as a salesperson, you need literature. You need sales literature. Roy realized he didn't have any sales literature. So what he did is he took what he could find from the Baha'i writings, not stuff that he wrote, but actual scripture from Baha'i writings, of hidden words and prayers and what was available. And he compiled them into tiny pocket-sized booklets. And he had them bound and printed. And my understanding is he had hundreds of thousands of these over his lifetime printed until other materials became more readily available. He called these booklets the Bens, after Big Ben, the clock tower in London. And the larger book was the Big Ben, and the smaller one was the Baby Ben. But we were introduced to Martha Root earlier, and Martha became like a sister to Roy, and she literally took cases and suitcases and trunk full of these Bens as she traveled around. Here she is with Roy and his family. As I said, she became like a sister to Roy, and Otis and Lori became like second parents. To Martha, an important part of her life. And Roy was a very an easygoing guy. He relaxed, and you can see he's on a picnic with his parents, and this is about as informal as he got. He still had his tie on, but he was unpretentious and quiet, and with a great sense of humor. But he was also, we know him for his generosity. He was able to not only to be generous with the things, with his money. Basically, he used his wealth for the faith while he was alive, and then everything he owned, his estate, all went to the faith after he what was left him. And one of the qualities, of course, that he had was obedience, and he remembered the story of the Bab in his imprisonment in Makru, and without having even the light of a candle. And he saw these generators, and he thought, well, wow, maybe Abdul Baha would like one of those generators so that we could put lights on the shrine of the Bab, to light the shrine of the Bab for his sake. And so he's anticipating this. He writes to Abdul Baha and said, would you like one? I will send one. And he gets a letter back from Abdul Baha. Incidentally, Abdul Baha sent over 60 personal letters and tablets to Roy, 60. And Abdul Baha says, yes, I would love one of those generators for the Shrine of the Bab. In fact, send 3. Obedience. Immediately. Didn't ask questions. Roy bought and sent 3 generators, plus all the equipment that was needed to install those, found someone who knew how to assemble and put them together. That would be work to be sent them. He never told Abdu'l-Baha that he had to borrow money to pay for, these were quite expensive at the time, to pay for that. So this was, he anticipated as well as of what was needed. And he was always anticipating things that maybe the master net or maybe the guardian net later. In fact, the fact that we talked about Roy and the Teaneck house property, how are you going to have a picnic in perpetuity if we don't own the property? So he made arrangements for that property to be paid or to be owned by the National Assembly. This is a good time for Kathy to kind of come in and finish the story. Thank you.
We also have to think about another very important aspect of Roy's life. Roy came into being as a very active Baha'i at around the same time the seeds were being sown in the West for the Baha'i administration to establish the Baha'i administrative order. You all probably know that in 1909, the Friends in the US and Canada sent representatives to Chicago to form the Baha'i Temple Unity, and they elected an executive committee, and from 1909 began to hold annual meetings with the primary purpose of erecting the house of worship in the Chicago area. Now, Roy was not elected to the executive committee at the actual meeting in 1909, but within that year, he was put on the executive committee, and here he is second from the left, standing behind some ladies. You can see him in this photo, a very handsome young man. So almost from the beginning, Roy is serving on the executive committee of Baha'i Temple Unity, which, because we had no National Spiritual Assembly, of course, began to fill that vacuum as the only elected national body in the United States and Canada. And at that time, the two countries were joined as a Baha'i community. This meant that when Abdu'l-Baha was in the United States in 1912, that he was very busy with a lot of the arrangements for Abdu'l-Baha. And he also was serving at the same time on what later became the Local Spiritual Assembly of New York, but it was, and it was starting to take that name on, but the local executive committee for the New York Baha'i community. So he is very involved, and as a businessman is able to bring his expertise, his organizing expertise, to this very important need of the community. In 1921, Abdu'l-Baha passed away very suddenly. At that time, as Gary mentioned, Roy's office on Wall Street had become the post office for North America. All correspondence between the Holy Land and North America went through his Wall Street office. It was really an informal headquarters for the Baha'i faith in North America at that time. So when the cable arrived from the Greatest Holy Leaf announcing the sudden passing of Abdu'l-Baha, most likely it was Roy who first saw that cable and then had the responsibility of disseminating that information, first to the executive board and the New York Board of Council, and then to the Friends across the United States. This was a very weighty task, and he had long been trained by Abdu'l-Baha how to maintain confidences and to deal with delicate, responsible tasks. When Shoghi Effendi arrived home at the end of December, about 5 weeks after the passing of his grandfather. For the first time, he found out from reading the will and testament that he was to be head of the House of Justice and guardian of the Baha'i faith. He had had no inkling from anything his grandfather had said to him prior to that, that he would be given such a responsibility. In fact, he had assumed that he would only assist after his grandfather's passing, which of course he had thought would happen many years in the future, in the election of the Universal House of Justice. He was then in a great hurry as the calendar turned over to 1922, because he had to ensure the unity of the faith and transfer the loyalty of the Friends from that of his amazing grandfather to Baha'i institutions, which did not yet exist. So one of the first things that he did in the latter part of January was call representatives from different Baha'i communities, both in the East and the West, to join him in the Holy Land for a consultation. The two North Americans that he called were Roy Wilhelm and Montford Mills. Roy instantly dropped what he was doing and as quickly as possible made arrangements to go to the Holy Land, leaving behind his trusty Baha'i employee, Nellie Lloyd, to take care of all the correspondence passing through his office. He and Montford traveled together. Montford was a lawyer, specializing in international law. He was based in New York, and he and Roy were already good friends. They get to Haifa in late January, early February. I guess it was early February by the time they get there, to meet with this unknown youth of 24, Shoghi Effendi, who had been a graduate student at the time of his grandfather's passing. Like all of the other people called to Haifa, most of them knew very little about Shoghi Effendi. And so this was their first real opportunity to take his measure, and they were not disappointed. Here we can see some of the people who were there that February and March for consultation. Curtis Kelsey on the far left was the young man that Roy had sent to install the Kohler generators. So he's there in the picture. Next to him is Imogene Hoag, an American who had often served as at the Holy Land under Abdul Baha, and then now under the Guardian as a hostess for the Western Pilgrims, but she also was very good at typing. So she was helping Shoghi Effendi with typing out his English translation of the Will and Testament and other correspondence that the Guardian had to take care of immediately once he assumed the role of head of the faith. And then immediately behind her is Montford Mills. Other people in the picture include Lady Blumfeld, Ethel Rosenberg, Fujita, Laura Clifford Barney, and Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney. And of course, the Guardian is there in the front between Laura Clifford Barney on the right and Imogene on his left. Other Americans happened to be there, including other executive board members of Temple Unity, but they were not considered the official representatives in the same way Roy and Montford were. And so they were excluded from the consultations that Shoghi Effendi began to hold, because he wanted them to help him arrive at an important decision. How quickly should the Universal House of Justice be established? Most of them had arrived expecting that it would be established forthwith. In fact, there was already pressure from the British government, which was at that time running the Holy Land, that some sort of governing Baha'i council would take over in Abdu'l-Baha's absence. The British certainly didn't want a 24-year-old graduate student running the Baha'i faith in the Holy Land. So there was a great deal of speculation about this. As the handful of representatives met behind closed doors with Shoghi Effendi, we know that they very quickly reached the conclusion that the faith was not yet ready to establish a house of justice. The house of justice, according to the will and testament, had to be elected by national spiritual assemblies. And in 1922, we had the executive board of Temple Unity in the United States, which wasn't truly a national spiritual assembly. And we had the Central Committee of Tehran, which was running that large Baha'i community, but it was not truly an elected body. It had been appointed at the direction of Abdu'l-Baha by the four hands of the cause of God appointed by Bahá'u'lláh. And those had lifetime memberships on it. One was still living in 1922. So there weren't any true national spiritual assemblies. Roy and Montfort, as well as the other friends present during that very important 6 or 8 weeks in the Holy Land in the winter, were given a tutorial of the will and testament by Shoghi Effendi himself. He had his English translation, newly completed, read aloud to them. And then one time during when they were all together in the Pilgrim House, he had a bundle brought in very reverently and put on a table. It was a bundle all wrapped in silk cloths. And then the guardian himself, with great respect and reverence, unwrapped that bundle. There were the 3 sections of the will and testament in Abdu'l-Baha's own hand. Each Westerner present was then called one by one to come up and examine the original documents. They were to look for Abdu'l-Baha's handwriting, for his signature, for his seals. This was especially important for Roy because he had been the mailman. He had seen thousands of original tablets pass through his office. He knew what was authentic and what was not. And so he was one of the ones called upon to look carefully at those documents and authenticate it. Shoghi Effendi also would take Roy and other representatives there in the Holy Land on long walks and talk to them about the state of the Baha'i community and what his vision was and what needed to be done as first steps to move the faith forward, the most urgent of which was to elect local and national spiritual assemblies. Roy, Montfort, and those others present were then given the task of getting back home as soon as possible so that they could attend the annual convention that was going to be held in Chicago, and to make sure that a national spiritual assembly was elected in 1922, not another executive board of Baha'i Temple Unity, and also to ensure that local spiritual assemblies were elected in as many communities in the United States and Canada as possible. When he and Montfort were at the convention, they were called upon to talk about their time with Shoghi Effendi, to provide the delegates and the others assembled there with the advice that had been entrusted to them by Shoghi Effendi. And not surprisingly, both of them were elected to the very first National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada. Now, dear friends, last year would have been the 100th anniversary of that election. Yet there were no celebrations in the United States for the 100th anniversary of our National Spiritual Assembly. Well, it turns out that even though one was elected in 1922 and then one in 1923, one in 1924, and Shoghi Effendi corresponded with him as the National Spiritual Assembly. It was only in 1925 that he said, okay, now you are truly a National Spiritual Assembly. So in the United States, the National Spiritual Assembly counts 1925 as its birth year, even though in fact there were national assemblies before that. And the interesting thing to me is that nobody ever bothered to take their photos as a group. Well, the first meeting after the convention was held at the Wilhelm home in 1923, the first 1923 meeting a year later. And here they are having lunch under the pergola at the Wilhelm property. And Roy got his camera out. He was a great camera bug. And like Joel, he loved to take photos. So he took a picture of the group. And so he's not in it, even though he's a member. There's also in this photo, the man on the far right is Janabi Fazl, who had been sent in 1923 by Shoghi Effendi to be an advisor to the National Spiritual Assembly. Now, in the early years of the National Assembly, the primary members, and particularly the officers, were mainly in the New York City area. And so many of the, if not most of the meetings were held in the New York City area, and often, particularly during good weather, at the Wilhelm properties. In fact, in 1929, Roy offered his cabin that he had constructed, that we saw a photo of a few minutes ago, to be the national headquarters of the National Assembly. And the National Assembly agreed. So particularly the Treasury and the publishing work all began to be based out of Roy's property. Here we have another picture of the National Assembly with you can see the cabin right behind Roy, which was where they kept the archives, where the work papers, and like I said, the many of the day-to-day business things were run out of that cabin. And here on the lady on the left is Bertha Hertlotz. She is the first paid employee doing office administrative work for the National Spiritual Assembly. She was living in New York. She was a professional stenographer, a member of the local Spiritual Assembly of New York, very trustworthy, and she served the National Assembly for over a decade, almost 2 decades. You can see the membership has changed. A number of these people would go on to be named Hands of the Cause. Here's another photo. This time you see Martha Root visiting with the National Assembly, and behind her is Bertha. Roy's mother is next to him, and then members of the National Assembly sprawled among some landscaping rocks there on the Wilhelm property. Most of the early years of the National Spiritual Assembly, because of geography, it was often difficult for the National Assembly to meet with more than a quorum. And one of the tactics it would use in order to have good quality consultation was to invite other people to participate in the consultation, but not the decision making. And which is maybe what happened when Martha was there with the National Assembly. Yet another picture at the Wilhelm property over the years. And you again see Bertha. Later, when in 1939, the National Assembly moved to the headquarters to Chicago, and that was the end of the Wilhelm property being used as the national headquarters. And from that point on, Roy's office in Wall Street was no longer the post office. Now, this is fascinating, all except for the 2 men on the right, George Latimer sitting down, and Alan McDaniel standing behind him. The rest of those members of the National Assembly would all be named Hands of the Cause. So on the back row, we have Leroy Iolas, Horace Hawley, Louis Gregory, and Roy. Front row, Fred Schafflacher, Dorothy Baker, Amelia Collins. Wouldn't you love to have sat in on those meetings? This is the last assembly that last year that Roy was elected in 1945, the last assembly group he would meet with. That year, he was diagnosed with colon cancer. And so for the first time, he had to, the National Assembly had to hold a by-election. He had been in ill health for some years and had begged Shoghi Effendi for permission to resign his membership on the National Assembly. The travel, the work was just too much for his ill health. Shoghi Effendi pleaded with him to not resign. He said, "You are my eyes and ears. I trust you. You tell me what's going on. You have good judgment. You know how to manage these things. And I count on you to be on that National Assembly." But the Guardian finally had to renege when Roy received the cancer diagnosis, and Elsie Austin would be elected in the first by-election to replace him. But he didn't stop then from continuing to serve Shoghi Effendi. He continued to be generous in his support of the building of the World Center and to help Shoghi Effendi out with all kinds of things, big and little, that were needed for the cause that he could make happen. Like, for example, after World War II, it was impossible to get paint, and all the holy places for preservation needed to be painted. So Roy shipped a huge amount of paint from the United States so that the World Center buildings could be taken care of. Finally, the cancer took its toll, and he passed away in early December 1951. The very same day that Shoghi Effendi announced the appointment of living hands of the cause, he also sent a cable naming Roy as a hand of the cause. Roy would be the last person named posthumously as a hand of the cause. Now, a few years later, the Guardian would name Hyde Dunn posthumously as a hand, but Hyde had already passed away some years before Roy. It was just at the same time he named Clara Dunn that he also named her husband. But the last time when someone died that he named them a hand was with Roy. His entire estate was given to Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi announced to the Baha'i world that as a result of receiving Roy's estate, he had been able to purchase some extremely important strategic property around the shrine of the Bab, and praised Roy for this last gift, naming him also a herald of the covenant. So we owe so much to Roy. When we see the shrine of the Bab lit at night and look at the magnificent terraces and gardens surrounding it, we are looking at a gift from Roy Wilhelm. Dear friends, I think it's now time to go to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Kathy and Gary and Joel. Just so much valuable information. So interesting. And of course, this is just a taste of what's in the book, which is filled with fascinating facts and details about the life of this servant to the servants. So please, as Kathy said, that we're now going to open up the format to questions that you can ask about Roy Wilhelm, about the book. Please, when you write your questions, please put them, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little icon marked Q&A. So if you could, when you write your questions, please put your questions in that, using that icon. If you put them in the chat, I may not be able to see them. It's kind of hit or miss there, because I'll only have the Q&A open. If I do see it in the chat, I'll try to get to it, but definitely please put it in the Q&A so that I can see it more easily. So let's see here. Oh, So here's some questions already. Did Roy spend much time at Greenacre? Do you know why he never married? The two questions. Did he spend much time at Greenacre, and do you know why he never married?
He was actually at Greenacre when Abdu'l-Baha was there. And he visited it many times. In fact, the National Assembly usually held one of its summer meetings at Greenacre, and so he would be there for that. He was very interested in Greenacre. Joel, would you like to answer the marriage question?
So, not knowing for sure, but Martha Root and Roy Wilhelm, neither of them married, and I believe it's because they dedicated their life to serving the faith. And that was their main purpose in life, without any distractions. Not that marriage is a distraction, but without any other responsibilities. They wanted to spend full time serving the faith.
We can also say that in both cases, they had health issues that might have prevented them from having children. That we don't know, but Mabel Garris told me years ago when she was researching Martha that Martha had some health issues when she was young that would have kept her from having children.
And just as a further note on Roy, when he was 16, he had actually jumped out of a barn and landed on a hay wagon, not knowing that there was a pitchfork hidden in the hay, injuring his back. And for the rest of his life, one of his health issues was back pain. So when he wrote letters, he actually had a standing desk, which is popular nowadays, but he used a draftsman's desk to stand up for all of his correspondence because it was uncomfortable to sit.
I believe that Roy was at Greenacre at the time that Abdu'l-Baha was there when Fred Mortensen showed up after his midnight ride across the country.
So Roy had to furnish some clothes to Fred.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. So
We have a comment from someone on YouTube. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Another question, did Roy ever teach or later get to know Baha'is in Costa Rica?
Nobody told us in Costa Rica.
Gary pioneered in Costa Rica and has been in touch with the friends there as we were researching this. They have been researching Roy for a long time because they knew about it.
But they looked through all the records that they could find in terms of property ownership and things like that, or any evidence, and couldn't find a smoking gun, as they say.
It's unfortunate that people who are not that far distant in time, we have no access to records. That's why it's so important to write these histories about the historic figures, because maybe 100 years from now, records that we have access to will no longer be available. For part of the research, individuals who were alive were actually interviewed who knew Roy Wilhelm, who actually worked with him in his home in Maine, etc. Some of these people were in their 90s and 80s, but in the future, they would not have been available for this part of the research. That's why it's so important to do research on these early figures.
Next question is, have you found any correspondence between Roy and Leonora Holsapple Armstrong or Leonora G. Sterling?
No. Now, the interesting thing is that we know from a statement that Shoghi Effendi made to him, that as the United States started sending out pioneers to Central and Latin America in the 30s, that Roy would correspond as an individual with those pioneers, encouraging them, helping them, probably in some cases deputizing them. So it's quite possible that he did, but we did not find anything in his archives from that.
Next question is Alapa. Thank you for an awesome presentation. Love you all. This person wanted to know if you can go into any more detail about why the Guardian would not allow or didn't. I remember you said it wasn't that he didn't allow, but he asked Roy not to resign from the National Spiritual Assembly at first. Is there any more detail on that?
Well, in the letters, he says that, this is a duty. If you're elected, you should, this is a duty, a responsibility. It would be better if I could quote the actual letters from Shoghi Effendi on it, but he does this with other people as well. And Horace Holly, for example, was going through a family crisis and asked to resign as secretary, not from the whole assembly, but as secretary of the National Assembly. And Shoghi Effendi wrote to him and just said, no, you can't do this. You can't do that, And then later, Shoghi Effendi found out the real reason, the family problems. And then he sort of reneged and said, well, get your family situation in order and then go back to serving. So, I think also we have to remember that at that time, there were so few people of great capacity available who were dedicated, who had the ability. I mean, one of the wonderful things about owning his own business was if he wanted to go to Chicago for an NSA meeting, he didn't have to ask anybody's permission and take vacation time. Roy could just do it. So he was an extremely valuable resource. He was dedicated, level-headed, wise, and had means to be able to serve that other people didn't have available. So he, the Guardian really guarded those resources. But I know that we document this in the book. It's heavily footnoted, and the correspondence with Shoghi Effendi is even more voluminous than Roy's correspondence with Abdu'l-Baha, which was also voluminous.
One of the aspects of the hand of the cause of God is teaching, but another is protection. So in that role as protection, Roy Wilhelm was involved in many, many different scenarios in this country protecting the faith. And he was called on by Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi to act in that role. So that's another reason he was heavily depended upon by the central figures of the faith for many, many aspects. As you know, he was the Office of Procurement. He delivered all these supplies to Israel, although it was not Israel at the time. The early publishing, serving on the National Assembly, the beginnings of the National Spiritual Assembly, all the administrative facets. Do you follow Robert's Rules of Orders? Do you follow Baha'i administration? All these early aspects of the faith, Roy was part of. He was greatly depended upon.
Next question is, did he write anything about the days with Abdu'l-Baha at Greenacre?
He wrote about and published a little pamphlet or booklet about his time in the Holy Land in 1907. But he wasn't someone who wrote about himself and his own experiences. He was with Abdu'l-Baha a lot. And part of how we know some of the stories about his time with Abdu'l-Baha in the United States is because he told other people who then they recorded what they remembered him saying. But he didn't write this stuff down very much. He was too busy.
And another question, do we know how Roy's mother heard about the faith?
Yes. So there was a believer in Ohio named Margaret Peake, who was evidently friends with Roy Wilhelm. She moved to Chicago at one point and took classes with Bahá'u'lláh, and in her correspondence with Laurie, actually sent her one of those early translations of the Hidden Words, which was a very poor translation by Haddad, but it still influenced her. As far as we're aware, Laurie became a Baha'i approximately in 1898.
The obscure question. It says on the question, this is an obscure question. Do you happen to know if the Crimson Hill, in quotes, in the vicinity of Baji is in possession of the faith?
No. Short answer.
No.
It's-
No, we're not, no, we don't know.
No,
Yeah.
I know, because as a pilgrim guide, I used to have to point it out to pilgrims, and it's, I think, unfortunately not a hill where it has anemones anymore. I think it's got development, probably apartment buildings on it, but it was not a place that we owned, unfortunately. For those who haven't read the book, Shoghi Effendi one day takes Roy and Montfort and Curtis Kelsey on a little bit of a road trip, and they go to the Baji, and then they go visit the Crimson Hill, and then they visit the Garden of Rizwan, then come back and go to the Carmelite Monastery. So a very memorable day for Roy. And the Crimson Hill at that time was in the middle of nowhere, and in the springtime it was just full of poppies and anemones. So it was much loved by Bahá'u'lláh.
Someone says, I just want to impart my gratitude for everyone's exceptional work in presenting this wonderful collection of Baha'i historical accounts. Bravo. Next question is for Joel. This is from a lady named Sheila. Did you receive my email about my neighbor, Betsy Heitschu, who isn't a Baha'i, but whose family home was in Stoneham, Maine? So she knew Roy Wilhelm when she was a child.
Yes, I did receive it, and I'm waiting to hear some more information from you. Yes, I did. I really loved reading that.
Awesome. Someone says, thank you so much, dear Joel, Kathy, Gary, for this precious and eternal work. I love the book. It is so inspiring. I'm about to finish it. There was a reference to Chicago Reading Room. What exactly happened there? Not sure why. I couldn't find any reference to it in the book. Thanks so much.
Several people have written about it. If you want to get a more full picture of the reading room, read Horace Holly, Infinite Horizons, The Life and Times of Horace Holly. That was a group of more mystical Baha'is in the Chicago area who, during the early years of World War I, when Abdu'l-Baha was cut off, didn't like the way the Board of Counsel for Chicago was running the Baha'i community. They wanted less administration, more mysticism, and they had a leader in this. And so they set up their own councils, a competing Baha'i group, and that was generally called the Reading Room. And this really blew up, not because of the schism in Chicago, but because of the way the Friends tried to deal with the schism. Charles Mason Remey sort of self-appointed himself and a few other people to become an investigating committee. They were very heavy-handed, wrote an extensive report. And the way they handled it, which was considered to be very cruel to these misguided Chicagoans, actually split the Baha'i community. There were communities taking the side of the committee and other people who were appalled at the way the committee operated. So, and when the war was over, this was one of the first tasks Abdu'l-Baha had to deal with, was to bring the Americans back together. The 1919 National Convention was supposed to be the Unity Convention, because this was when they were going to get over that. They had received cut it out guys, and the other thing was the instructions from Abdu'l-Baha, but also the Friends were too quick to name people covenant breakers, and Abdu'l-Baha had to confirm for them that none of them had the right to call some other believer a covenant breaker. Only Abdu'l-Baha could do that. So anyway, the 1919 convention is mainly remembered for the tablets of the divine plan being unveiled, but it was also the time when they were trying to put behind them the reading room incident. So if you read Infinite Horizons, you'll get more information about that.
I have a question here. Have any children, but he had kitties in quotes. And this is to Joel. Please tell us about his goats.
In 1907, when Roy went on pilgrimage, he noted to Abdu'l-Bahá that he was having some stomach issues, possibly an ulcer. And Abdu'l-Bahá gave him several suggestions, one of which was to have goat milk, and another was to have a particular type of grain cereal. But what Roy did when he went back home is that he built a shed on his property in Teaneck and had a goat herd. And actually, John Bosch, who was in California, who was corresponding with Roy, they were friends, told Roy what brand of goats to purchase, which had better milk qualities. When Roy would travel to various places and stay with Baha'i friends, he would send ahead 24 hours in advance a 5-pound package of coffee and this particular cereal that he wanted to have, which required, I believe, a 24-hour cooking process. So the hostess would get these 2 items in the mail, and she would have to, it was usually the woman, have to prepare this particular cereal. When Roy moved to a second residence in Stoneham, Maine, his goat herd blossomed up to 350 goats. They were award-winning. He won a number of awards. One item, he said, one summer when they had, was it 2,000 or 3,000 guests? I don't remember the exact number, that they made 600 gallons of goat ice cream for the guests. When World War II came, the goat herd was diminished greatly by order of the government. But at one point, he had 350 goats. He had cattle, he had dogs, he had a large number of animals on his property. And some of the people that we interviewed were the ones who worked on his farm. He actually had 3 buildings on this mountain in Stoneham, one of which was an enormous barn. And when you read the book, you can read about the FBI investigation of the barn.
Next question is, what was the most wonderful thing about writing a collaborative book together? And what was the most challenging thing?
The most wonderful thing was for Kathy and I was to get to meet Joel and his family. And working with your wife on a project, there are no challenges. So somebody else can answer that question.
For me, being able to interact with 2 incredible people whose wealth of knowledge is astronomical. The collaboration was so smooth. We would meet every week by Zoom. We visited each other in person several times. They've become very good friends. And Kathy and my wife's birthday is one day apart.
Yes.
They're both from Richmond, Virginia.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
when I'm talking to them on Zoom, Kathy always wants to make sure she says hi to my wife.
Right. We love Vicky. So as everybody loves Vicky, Gary and I are still married after this project, but I can tell you that there is no book that is not a collaborative project, if it's any good. Nobody can write a good book, nonfiction, without many people helping. And we had not only the 3 of us, Joel did most of the research, we did the writing, and Gary and I would sit with our coffee in the morning and go over what part he was working on, what part I was working on. But we had at least 3 people who read the manuscript on our behalf. And then we, of course, had Chris as our editor and other people who contributed in various ways. So all good books are a collaborative process.
I would recommend writing a book with your spouse. And actually, it was quite amazing when you think about it, because we both have very distinct writing styles. And so at the end of the day, we wanted a book that didn't every other chapter look at like somebody else wrote it. So we had to have to work very closely to make sure that we had one voice coming and threading through the whole book. So,
Let's see. Next question is, thank you for this informative and well-researched presentation. How can how do you think this information and legacy of the early American believers be used to accelerate the formal development of the faith in America and the Americas? That's an interesting one.
yeah,
I
this
think
is a
that-
question for Kathy.
The early believers are inspiring for us. I mean, one of the things Abdu'l-Bahá said to the first Western pilgrims when these were mainly women was think about Mary Magdalene and Saint Barbara and some of the other great women of Christianity. They had 24 hours in the day just as you do and fewer resources, and look at what they accomplished. So I think we can look at these early believers and see what they accomplished. But also, one of the important things to learn from the study of the life of these early believers and the processes that they were part of is that the faith is organic. It's always transforming and changing. And the ones that we celebrate are the ones who kept up with that transformation. Because there were people who at various points did wonderful things, but they couldn't keep up with the changes of the faith and they fell by the wayside. And that didn't happen with the people who were named Hands of the Cause and so forth. So there are many wonderful lessons. They're inspiring, and I think they will inspire seekers. I mean, if you're working with someone who's a businessman, tell them about Roy Wilhelm. Use him as a wonderful example of how to be a spiritual businessman.
Oftentimes people have questions who are wealthy. How can they serve the faith? Is their wealth an impediment? And you can look at examples of what Roy did to counter that. But one of the most beautiful examples I can think of is the passing, at the time of the passing of Shoghi Effendi, when the living Hands of the Cause, I believe 25 of the 27 assembled in the Holy Land, and nominated 9 of them to be in charge of the faith, to aid the establishment of the Universal House of Justice at his first election in 1963, going from very few national assemblies, I believe it was 56 assemblies by 1963, if my number is correct. And then they relinquished all power and said, you can't elect us to members of the Universal House of Justice. This is just one example of the integrity of the Hands of the Cause of God. Roy is, of course, one of that body.
Next question is, did he solve the mystery of why his father was told it wasn't a good time to go on pilgrimage, but that his son could go?
We'll never know, but interestingly, Abdu'l-Bahá said to Corinne True that there were, that for some individuals, if you didn't go at the right time in the right headspace, you know, that I'm paraphrasing, or when your heart wasn't in the right place, it could actually be harmful for you to go. So anyway, this is one of the mysteries. We have to have permission to go on pilgrimage. And also, by the way, you know, there are Baha'u'lláh himself set criteria for pilgrimage. You had to have permission, you couldn't be in debt, and you couldn't, had to be in good health.
One of the other aspects, again, it's a mystery, is that travel in 1907 to Palestine was a little bit hazardous. You had to take many different ships and trains and boats. You had to get permission. There was different types of currency. This was not where you could take tout tours to go to Palestine. So to have Roy's mother, Laurie, had to travel with a companion to help navigate all these things. So it was natural that Roy would go with his mother. But why Otis was not allowed? I agree with Kathy. We'll never really know, but Abdu'l-Bahá realized it wasn't his correct time.
Someone says, appreciate your amazing work. I was so honored to meet the grandson of Curtis Kelsey this past week as I am reading your book. Can you please touch on some of his, I guess, some of Roy's challenges with Dr. Farid and Ahmad Sohrab? The book is remarkable.
Thank you for that. And I would again refer them to Infinite Horizons, where we go into that in much greater detail with Farid. And Farid was, after he broke the covenant, moved out to Los Angeles. And so we know that Roy was asked to meet with covenant breakers on behalf of Abdul Baha and then later by Shoghi Effendi. And I'm guessing, but we don't know who those people were. Clearly, Sohrab was probably one of them because he was in New York and Roy was in New York. But Farid is certainly a good possibility as well. So Farid's time in LA, Farid had a bigger impact actually on the British Baha'i community than he did the American community, but he certainly impaired the Californians in the Southern California. But Sohrab was a huge problem in the New York City community until his own death in 1958. So Roy, I'm sure, had many opportunities to try to deal with both of them, but we don't have the details of that.
Some questions from our YouTube audience. One question is, what might the perception of the position and station of the prominent believers who had been in touch with Abdul Baha and the beloved guardian have been among the friends?
Obviously, we all have put people on pedestals for various reasons, and anyone who was personally had those wonderful opportunities have been minor Baha'i celebrities for a long time. I remember years ago when I was in the Wilmette community, we had 5 people attending feast who had all met Abdul Baha and took a group picture of them. So, but that doesn't, we have to always remember Kitabi hearsay. The fact that someone said, Abdul Baha said this to me, doesn't mean that it has any special, it might be very interesting, but it doesn't have any special standing as authoritative. And we love those stories, but we have to remember that that's the case.
They were pilgrim's notes,
Right.
which are fun to read, but they're pilgrim's notes.
Right.
And from someone else on YouTube, from Spain, thank you for the presentation. How did Roy help the beloved guardian to secure the property in Haifa? Thank you.
That's very interesting. The British mandate, when they took over Palestine in 1922, limited how much property an individual could own. And obviously people got around it illegally, but the legal definition is not in standards that we understand, but it's approximately 5 acres is the amount that an individual is allowed to own. There's much more property than 5 acres that the faith owned. They had farms in various places, etc. As a result, individuals in other countries, a lot of them in the United States, own property in the Holy Land. The deeds were in Turkish, and I cannot read Turkish. So I actually contacted the Universal House of Justice, and about 4 years later, they answered and told me where all the properties were that Roy owned, which as soon as Shoghi Effendi, when the state of Israel came into being, were then deeded to the faith. And part of the property was part of the Shrine of the Bab, the Pilgrim's House, the original Western Pilgrim's House, and other properties. But I know that there was a lot of land transfer. The state of Israel wanted this piece, and the faith would trade pieces of land at various sites. I know where the Tablet of Carmel was revealed at the top of that spot. There's a military outpost and part of that land was transferred, which the faith had, which was then given to the state of Israel. On his death, additional lands were given. So it was a large amount of property. The actual numbers are in the book.
He even allowed his name to be used in lawsuits as in Israel. So if Shoghi Effendi had to sue somebody over something, Roy allowed his name to be in the lawsuit as one of the parties. So Shoghi Effendi knew that if Westerners were involved legally, the one, that would impress the British, but two, that they were more likely to get a fair shake. So he was very happy to accommodate the Guardian in that way.
I have just a couple of comments. Another comment from YouTube. Yes, you are correct. It's quite inspiring to learn the stories of the early believers. I'm researching Millie Collins and finding the same thing. Very inspiring. Another person says, loved reading and rereading Lighting the Western Sky. Thank you, Kathy. And another person says, thank you for this inspiring and moving account about Roy Wilhelm. Excellent presentation by the authors of this precious book. I can't wait to read the book. We have now a Baha'i trivia question. What kind of goats did Roy have?
They were called Ayeshire, Ayrshire,
They
There
were
you
a
go.
Swiss
They're
breed,
Swiss.
Swiss breed.
known for sweet milk and copious milk.
That was an easy one. That wasn't trivia.
Oh, that's, well, this trivia for,
That was easy.
I got to write that one down. I got to use that in my a Yamiha trivia when our community has a Yamiha trivia night. Question here: did Abdul Baha tell Roy about his vision about being wedded to the cause, wedded to Bahá'u'lláh, when Roy returned to Akka, or when Roy returned to Akka, or when Abdul Baha in 1912, when Abdul Baha was in America? Please clarify. Thank you for the fantastic book.
I
We're
think
making
that
an educated guess.
was in 1912, probably, because Roy never went back to Israel, to the Holy Land, until after Abdul Baha passed away. So the guess is that it probably was in 1912.
When Abdul Baha was not allowed outside of the city gates of Akka at the time he went on pilgrimage in 1907. So he'd already said goodbye to Abdul Baha when he went to the Rizwan Garden, and would not see him again until 1912.
So we don't actually know what was said, but that could be the only time, because in letters, I did not read a letter where it was talked about. So if it was by voice, it had to be in 1912 if it happened.
Question is, when did you guys start the project? How can a surgeon find time to write a book? My hat is off to you, Dr. Nizin.
So I started doing research probably in the early 1990s. My writing skills are not up to Kathy's and Gary's. So we collaborated for probably close to 2 years on this project. And I did an initial version of the book, sent it to the publishing trust who was interested, and they immediately told me I needed a co-author, which was fortuitous, because in its present form, it is incredible prose from these two. I did a lot of the research, they did most of the writing. So research happened over many, many years. I would visit archives in Washington, New York, at the National Center. I interacted with the Universal House of Justice. One of the interesting interactions, just to say, the lights that Gary showed that were used to illuminate the Shrine of the Bab and Baji and Abdul Baha's house, those 3 spots, were from Kohler. So I wrote to Kohler because I had the receipts from Roy showing the model number of those power plants that were sent. The president of Kohler wrote back to me saying that they had a flood in their basement and a lot of those early records were destroyed. And they appreciated getting one of these records, which was one of the first power plants that they had made. They only started making them in 1919. And this was when Roy bought it in 1919. So he had bought one of the early ones, or three of the early ones. And the president of Kohler was grateful to see this record because their early correspondence had all been lost. So it's over many years doing many bits of research.
That's awesome.
Kathy knew a vast, and Gary knew a vast amount of additional information that filled in the book too.
It was helpful having just finished the Horace Holly book because Horace and Roy were buddies, and it covers much of the same ground in terms of the development of the institutions. The Horace Holly book is more detailed about the development of the institutions. Roy was very involved, particularly in the financial development of the faith. He, of course, had good relations with bankers as a businessman with an honest reputation. So when we needed to get bank loans to start the construction on the House of Worship, he helped establish those relationships with major banks. And for many years, the last years of his life, he was national treasurer. He was always involved in finance. He was also usually involved in publications and seeing that things were printed. He made arrangements and funded the offices for the Star of the West and so forth. You know, a lot of these things that happen, we forget there are always people behind the scenes that make it possible.
When there was a shortfall in salaries at the National Center, Roy, as treasurer, would out of his own pocket make up the difference.
Yeah.
He was an incredible human being.
I have some more nice comments here. Congrats. Just wanted to say excellent presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much for this fascinating bit of history, and thank you for writing, publishing the book. One question, I seem to recall that Roy taught the faith to Mr. Chan S. Liu when he was a student at Princeton. He later, together with others in his distinguished family, were the first believers in Canton, Guangzhou. Do you know anything about the relationship to Roy?
I do not.
You know, he was very interested in the work with Japanese and Chinese populations. And he did approach some of the universities in the New York area, New York, New Jersey area, to find out about, to find people who could do translations of Baha'i writing so he could help produce literature in those languages that could be used in the West Coast, and also as Martha Root traveled. So that it could have been through Martha Root, because Martha Root also traveled in China extensively, and they were very avid correspondents. So that's just a speculation, but he was very interested in East Asian, the East Asian teaching work.
One little anecdote is that on his property in Teaneck, he actually constructed a torii gate, you know, the Japanese gate, a huge one on the property. So.
The first structure he built before the log cabin was this torii. And a torii, the significance in a Shinto temple is the entrance between the profane world and the sacred precincts of the temple. So it's very significant that he built a torii on his property, even before he built the cabin. And we have a number of pictures of it, which I think we put one in the book.
We did.
Yeah.
Someone asked, is this camp in Maine owned by the NSA?
Unfortunately not.
His resting place is there. Roy's resting place is there, but
yeah.
And Maine law says that even if someone else owns the property, you're not allowed to restrict access to a gravesite on private property. So Baha'is still on a regular basis visit the gravesite, which you saw the telegram that Gary showed. Gary showed it?
Yeah.
And that's actually inscribed on his gravestone, that telegram. but the property was sold after his passing. The faith did not have the funds in the 1950s to purchase it.
That was a property that that was referred to earlier, that was used to buy much of the land around the Shrine of the Bab, the proceeds from that sale.
And someone says, wonderful presentation. Note medical, Dr. Abraham Verkes is a tremendous author. Keep writing. I think this is to all of you guys. And the study guide for the Epistle to the Son of Wolf is by a cardiac surgeon, Dr. Fanana Pazir. So some encouragement there. Looks like this is our last question. And I think I remember you guys saying this, but just to remind us, do you know why Roy named his booklets Big Ben and Little Ben?
Okay, so we can only guess. At the end of his 1907 pilgrimage, he went to London with his mother as part of his travels. And Big Ben, here's your trivia question, is actually the name of the bell in the tower. It's not the name of the tower or the building, it's the name of the bell. And someone built a duplicate in London of the tower, which is called Little Ben. And it's actually a 17-foot replica, which is standing on one of the street corners in London. So there actually is a Big Ben and a Little Ben in London. He traveled to London in 1907. We can only guess that impressed him as a good name.
Well,
And
you know,
I was just going to say, the clock and clock tower are erroneously referred to as Big Ben, but it's actually, as Joel said, it's actually the bell
That's for your next trivia night,
yeah,
Chris.
put that in there.
I've got that down. I'm gonna write that one down. Thank you so much, guys. And that's the end of the questions. Everyone, I have put the link once again in the chat for you to go to Bahá'íBookstore.com and please avail yourself of this wonderful book. You know, we covered a lot here, but of course, there's much more in the book that these three awesome writers have given. Thank you so much, Joel, Gary, Kathy. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your book, to talk about Roy. We really appreciate it. And of course, we will be having a third seminar later today. So please go on Wilmette.org and register for that one if you haven't. Again, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for moderating, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
No problem. And it was great writing with you, great editing. You guys are great authors to work with. So thank you again.
thank you so much.